Okay, thank you all for coming. Those who are here in person and those who are joining us virtually. It's a great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Todd Robinson, Assistant Secretary for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. Todd is one of our stellar career diplomats for the United States of America. He has served as ambassador in Guatemala, Charge in Caracas, where he had a wonderful time that maybe we'll hear a story about. He's also been senior advisor on Central America in the Western Hemisphere office, and he worked previously in INL, where I also had the pleasure of working with him there, as in a few other places. Then he had some other assignments in other parts of the world, including Consul General in Barcelona, which was a nice shift. But INL, as we call this, International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs in the Department of State, is really one of the key bureaus at the State Department, addressing some of the toughest problems in the world, trying to build partnerships with governments around the world, with other parts of the U.S. government that deal in these troubled areas of international crime, particularly international drug trafficking, but trafficking in everything they deal with. And they also have the really tough job of trying to help fight corruption around the world, especially with partners who are interested in fighting corruption, which is, as we may hear, is one of the challenges in dealing with corruption. You really, in all of these areas, you have to have partners that are willing to work with you. And if you do, INL is there to help build and strengthen those partnerships. So it's a great pleasure, Todd, to have you here. Please come up and share some remarks.
All right, thank you. So for those of you who don't know, you are somewhat in the presence of greatness here. You have a number of ambassadors, actual and former. Piper was an ambassador, Ambassador Tony Wayne, career ambassador, which is the highest rank in our system. John Feely, ambassador to Panama, and all around good guy. So you should take advantage. Thank you for the kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here today. And as Ambassador Wayne noted, my name is Todd Robinson, Assistant Secretary for the Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, also known as INL, also known as the Bureau of Drugs and Thugs. Our mission is to keep U.S. citizens safe by countering crime, illicit drugs, and instability abroad. And our motto, which we've just recently updated, is security through justice. And that seems today more important now than ever. We play a critical role in addressing some of the Biden administration's national concerns, including overdose epidemic, countering corruption, and the war in Ukraine. But before we go into that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself and my journey to becoming a State Department employee and eventually an ambassador and assistant secretary. Started my career 35 years ago in Bogota, Colombia. That was my first assignment. During that time, I've been a special assistant to the late Secretary Madeleine Albright. I've had leadership positions in Spain and Albania. I was both chief of mission and ambassador in Guatemala, deputy chief of mission and ambassador in Guatemala. And I spent a long 6 months as our charge d'affaires in Venezuela until President Maduro decided it was not love and kicked me out first. And then a year later, we ended up closing the embassy completely. Before all of that, I was a journalist, which is something I share with Secretary Blinken. But it was really public service that drew my attention. um, and led me to wanting to represent our country abroad. And I think also, I mean, I think we all harbor this desire to change the world. Something I've honed in on during my career is that I worked for the American people. My first president was Ronald Reagan. My first Secretary of State was George Shultz. And all of them, and all of the time that I've worked for the presidents and secretaries of state since then, I have really focused on making the United States stronger and less susceptible to the threats from abroad. One major threat we're facing today is the drug overdose crisis, which you all may be aware is being driven by synthetic drugs like fentanyl that are illicitly manufactured outside of our borders, largely. It's ravaging our country and is the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 49. Think about that. The crisis is among the administration's top security and health priorities. In the past 6 months, my team has had one number in mind, 107,000. That is roughly the number of people who died of drug overdoses in the United States in 2021, almost 70% of which were due to opioid overdoses. Last month, I testified in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about our international efforts to stem the horrific flow of fentanyl into the United States. I did so with the DEA administrator and the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy Director, who are some of the strongest partners that we have in tackling this priority. We also continue to urge the People's Republic of China, which is really the elephant in the room, to re-engage in discussions and take meaningful action to end the diversion of chemicals used as precursors for illicit drug production. Synthetic drugs pose too urgent and too complex a threat for all of us to fail to find common ground. I just returned from a trip to Vienna, where I participated in the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, one of the most important meetings for countries to coordinate and agree on joint action addressing these issues. There, I emphasized our #1 priority, coalescing international partners to work together and confront the public health and security challenges posed by synthetic drugs. And I urge my international counterparts to help develop and strengthen strong domestic foundations for information sharing about drug trends, and to take full advantage of the UN framework to internationally control dangerous synthetic drugs. We also highlighted INL's efforts to improve the quality of prevention treatment and recovery support services through the development of international standards and the training of the professionals that combat substance use disorders throughout the world, including the many dedicated professionals in the United States. As Ambassador Wayne mentioned earlier, another global issue we face is corruption. Too often, transnational organized crime groups use their funds and influence to corrupt officials and institutions, which creates permissive environments where crime can thrive. This is why President Biden made combating corruption a national security and foreign policy priority, and why Secretary Blinken designated the US government's first coordinator on global anti-corruption. We know that to defeat corruption, we must work with foreign governments, the private sector, civil society, international organizations, and members of academia to ensure we build trust from the ground up. For example, last year, with INL support, Colombia passed a new transparency, prevention, and combating corruption law to deter and detect corruption and money laundering, and increase the Attorney General's asset seizure and forfeiture powers for goods linked to public corruption. In Mexico, INL and State Attorney General's Office and the State Attorney General's Office partnered with a civil society organization to launch an online tool to enhance transparency and combat impunity by enabling citizens to file criminal complaints through an app. INL is well equipped to be at the forefront of some of the administration's core national security interests with our breadth of institutional experience and strong partnerships. But one hallmark of pride I have for INL is its capacity as an agile and effective organization, where we have proven ourselves with our unwavering support for Ukraine in the last year and well before Russia's invasion. Following the 2014 Revolution of Dignity, INL deepened our partnership with the government of Ukraine. When we were asked to assist with justice sector reform, we wholeheartedly accepted the challenge to bolster Ukraine's institutions. The brave forces you see today, Ukraine's border guards, national police, anti-corruption institutions, the prosecutor's office, have all received extensive assistance and training from INL and our interagency partners over the years. When we saw Russian troops mass along the Russia-Ukraine and Belarus-Ukraine borders last year, INL pivoted our resources and immediately jumped into action. Since December 2021, we have committed nearly $700 million in support to our Ukrainian partners. INL has delivered hundreds of armored vehicles, thousands of bulletproof vests, plane loads of tactical equipment, medical gear, and other field supplies to help Ukraine. I hope these examples have given you a better idea of the global issues INL tackles and the importance we place on our strong partnerships around the globe. That, Ambassador Wayne, I'm happy to answer any questions the group may have for me today. Thank you.
Yes, bring your coffee. I have my coffee up. So we'll have an informal. We'll have an informal chat.
Thank you.
And I'll grab my coffee here too.
Oh,
so it'll be.
Take your seat.
No, it's all right. You just took the place where my coffee was sitting. All right. Well, it's great to have you here, Todd, Ambassador Robinson.
Thank you.
As I said earlier, I think INL is one of the underappreciated overachievers at the State Department, playing a key role in so many really difficult problems, from drug trafficking to the vast array of transnational criminal organizations that exist, and then the really difficult task of trying to help partners strengthen their justice systems and deal with corruption, which are related, but not the same thing. They work in about 70 countries around, 90 countries around the world, 90 countries around the world. And so in many of the embassies where I served, INL was just a key element and was often really the liaison with our law enforcement agencies and could speak diplomat and speak law enforcement at the same time, which is very important inside the US government, as well as working with partners around the world. So, Todd, maybe say a little bit about some of the best practices for success in some of these areas. Maybe first just talking about a little bit about drug trafficking and dealing with drugs, because it is one of the most lethal problems that we face right now in the United States. And we have challenges with one of our neighbors, our southern neighbor, where much of this the deadly drugs at least get mixed together and shipped northward. But the precursors for those drugs come largely from China. And so there are at least two big phases in dealing with this problem. And maybe just say a little bit about how you look at that.
Well, obviously it's a really complex problem. We are in a situation now where China largely does not engage with us diplomatically or really in any other sphere except for maybe the economic side. So one of the things we've had to do is really be creative and be humble, because if we're going to deal with China, we've actually had to ask for others' help. Part of the reason I went to Vienna was to meet some of my counterparts from countries around the world, some of them close to China, others of them not so close to China, but countries that China does talk to, and ask them for help. Make sure that they are, in their engagements with China, raising the fentanyl issue, or I should say, raising the synthetic opioids issue. Because as you know, for us, the problem is fentanyl. In the Middle East, the problem is Captagon. In Africa, it's a different drug. In Asia and Oceania, it's a different drug altogether. So, but the precursors for almost all of these drugs are all coming from China. So if we can develop a coalition, a global coalition, that will, at the very least, raise these issues with China, at most, sit down with us to strategize about how we can get at this issue together, we might be able to see some movement. And so that's what we've been doing. I've been traveling around the world. Started this last trip. I started in Georgia, Tbilisi. I went to Rome and visited with our good friends at the Vatican, which if you don't know about the Vatican, you really ought to read up about them, because the things they do around the world that nobody knows about are legendary. And then I ended up in Vienna at the CND, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, all with the same idea of asking for help and asking for these countries to join our coalition.
Well, that's good. And maybe eventually we could get to an international agreement that actually has better tracking of precursors.
Yeah.
Which has been an idea out there for a long time, but very hard to get people to agree to that. Let me jump for a minute to working with bilateral partners. The partnership is very important in getting trusted partners, and it's very hard to bring about change when you don't have trusted partners. What are some of the best practices and some of the biggest challenges, even if a government says, oh, yes, we'd like your help to deal with this trafficking organization or with this corruption problem? What are the challenges, and then what are the best practices for getting through that?
Well, the challenges are obvious. If you have a government that is not willing or able to acknowledge that it has a corruption problem and then do something about it, then it's going to be a tough slog. If you're faced with something like that, then you have to start looking for champions, right? You have to start looking for people within those governments that you can support, sometimes openly, sometimes not so openly, that you can hope will get to a position and get to a time where they will be able to affect change in their country. One of the tools that you used and the other ambassadors used really well is the International Visitors Program, where we, even as new officers, young officers, identify people in the country that are a little bit off the radar, but show some leadership. And we can bring them to the United States for anywhere from 3 weeks to 2 months, and cultivate them and show them how we do things here in the United States. And you never know, later on, as we're all growing older in our positions, some of these people end up being attorneys general. Tony Blair was an IVLP. Jacques Chirac was an IVLP. These are people who ended up leading their countries. So these are some of the tools that we can use. We INL are blessed with a fairly large foreign assistance budget. So, and, police departments, border guards, prosecutors, they love bright, shiny new toys. They love technology. These are ways that you can gain trust, confidence, and later on influence. But it also, and the other ambassadors in the room will identify this as well. A lot of time, difficult conversations with government leaders, forcing them to, look in the mirror and decide, do you want better for your country and your people or not? Is this just, rhetoric in order to gain and maintain power? Or is this really about making ordinary people's lives better? And sometimes that conversation goes well. I've been in situations where that conversation has gone well, and in situations where it has not gone well. But you have to do it. We have to do it. At the end of the day, it only benefits the United States if we have partners that want to do the right thing, that want strong democratic institutions, that want a strong economy that are open, that is open and can compete on the global stage. And so that's what we're trying to do. We work very closely with police departments around the world, recognizing that there is a lot that we have to learn and a lot more that we can be, and recognizing that we can be a lot better. But if you're not having that conversation at all, Russia and China are. And at the end of the day, despite all of my reservations about the way we do policing in the United States, I would still rather have our model prevailing than either Russia's or China's.
And we've had to learn a lot along the way. I can remember we were trying to help in Kosovo and the former Yugoslavia, and we just did not have access to the police advisors to come and help in that part of the world. But now you've built, your bureau over the years have built a whole network of people doing that.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned soft power, and you now give out anti-corruption champion awards.
That's right.
That, which is another part of this soft power. You want to just say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I can't remember when we started, but it was before the pandemic for sure. We recognize that there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are champions out there. There are people who are willing to put themselves on the line to expose corruption. And like we were doing with the Women of Courage, we decided to recognize those anti-corruption champions. Sometimes they're journalists, sometimes they are whistleblowers. A lot of times they're from civil society organizations that are risking their lives every day to expose what's really going on in their countries. And it's really funny because sometimes when we confer this award on someone, it sort of gives them a little protection. It gives them this aura. But we've had people go back to their countries after accepting their award and are thrown in jail. So it can be a double-edged sword.
Right, for sure. And the work that you do, there's been a lot of talk about democratic backsliding in the world, but a lot of the work that you do is really aimed at bolstering democracy and the whole sense of rule of law, the importance of rule of law, and you have capacity building programs and others for those that are interested in strengthening their institutions. Maybe say a little bit about the kind of assistance you all provide.
Well, we have, like I mentioned earlier, we have the bright, shiny toys that we can provide, but we have, we're fortunate that we have access to our partners in the interagency. So we can draw on experts from the Department of Justice, DEA, Department of Treasury, FinCEN, the Department of Treasury's office that handles complex in financial transaction investigations. We can call on all of them to go to Kosovo, to go to the Middle East, to work with our trusted partners, to do training, to help them with investigations. We have access to the FBI forensic labs, so we can help countries do investigations, either sending people there or bringing their evidence to the United States. We have access to all of that. We also have a very close relationship with a number of state and local police forces around the country, which is great because they have language ability. So we can get police from California or Washington State or Oregon to go to Asia because they have this access to language. We can get Creole speakers from New York and New Orleans to go to Haiti, which is a country that is right now in free fall. They need a lot of help. The Haitian National Police needs a lot of help, and we can draw on our relationships with these state and local partners to go and offer that assistance.
Well, that's great. Now, one of the other areas you pursue is going after the money. Money trail is really important for criminality of all kinds. Maybe you can say a little bit about the work that's underway here, some of the progress and some of the challenges.
We worked very hard over a number of years, and I think some of the ambassadors in this room have worked on this as well, to develop a transparency, anti-corruption global framework. In Europe, it's the Financial Action Task Force, EDGMOT.
And
FATF.
and then Edgemont is the FIU.
Exactly. EDGMOT is the Financial Investigative Network that the United States, most European countries, some Asian countries, a number of African countries all belong to. This allows us to identify those countries that are not doing the right thing. We can, as a group, isolate them, not allow them access to our banking systems, and if they're willing, offer them the necessary tools to meet the requirements of this architecture that's been set up. We do that around the world. Other countries, obviously, the European Union is another one, another group that offers this kind of support. It is a point of pride for a lot of countries to be part of this group. So we can leverage the fact that countries want to be part of this group to, again, get at this issue of transparency, good governance, and anti-corruption. Now, is it perfect? Obviously not. If you've followed the investigations in the Panama Papers, you know that as governments are working more and more to set up the type of global architecture that would make financial transactions more transparent, there are experts and lawyers and government officials out there trying to hide their money. And it's an ongoing battle every day. And we just keep at it.
Right. And as I got to learn at a recent trial in New York, some of our best apparent partners are often doing that, very sadly. So let me invite people to come up and ask questions. And as we transition, Todd, I want to ask you a little bit about the Foreign Service more broadly. We have a number of students here at SIS who look forward to potentially to working in some kind of international service and potentially working at the State Department. So could you just say a little bit about that, your experience and why it's worthwhile exploring?
Sure. So I joined the department in 1986, 87, something like that. I was fortunate. I knew this is what I wanted to do from a very early age. There's a long story involved, but the short version is back in the 70s, we were negotiating the Strategic Arms Limitation Talk Treaties, SALT 1 and SALT 2. The Senate had to ratify this treaty, and for the first time, this was televised. I saw this and was mesmerized. I wanted to be Warren Christopher, Harold Brown, Zbigniew Brzezinski. I wanted to do those, to work on things like that. And much to my mother's disdain, because the Senate ratification hearings were at the same time as General Hospital. But eventually she let me watch it, and here I am.
That's great. All right, please introduce yourself and ask your question. You can.
Yeah, it's on.
Okay, there we go. Might be a little bit. There we go. Hello.
There you go.
Twisted it.
This is part of the Foreign Service test. Can you adjust a microphone stand?
All right. Cool. Thank you, Ambassador Robinson, for coming to speak to us today. My name is Bob Greenbaum. I am a second-year graduate student at SIS. I'm studying U.S. foreign policy and national security. I'm also an intern at the American Academy of Diplomacy. So I'm definitely hearing a lot of experiences about personal experiences about the Foreign Service from our members and former ambassadors. So also I'm in a practicum about the Northern Triangle, democratic backsliding in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And I was very curious on your experience as ambassador to Guatemala, and also talk maybe a little bit about INL's operation in Guatemala, how it affects, like how have you seen it affecting democratic or trying to promote democracy and preventing democratic backsliding in Guatemala?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a great area. I salute you for focusing on it. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador now are going through, all three countries, frankly, are going through relatively tough times in terms of democratic backsliding. I was in Guatemala as ambassador from 2014 to 2017. What we saw happening was part, I think, of a much larger phenomena around the world where citizens had enough. They knew corruption was going on for years, but because that's the way the system was, they had largely figured it out. They figured out how to exist in that system. What happened in Guatemala, very short story, the government at the time had set up a scheme by which importers could get around paying the taxes that on the duties on their goods if they paid the right people. And the right people happen to be the president and the vice president of the country. The investigations that followed largely supported by a UN anti-corruption agency. It was the International Commission Against Corruption in Guatemala, or CICIG, working very closely with the Attorney General's office, which was heavily funded by my bureau, INL. They were able to do the complex investigation that directly implicated the president and the vice president of the country. Eventually, the president went to jail, the vice president went to jail, half the cabinet went to jail, a third of the Congress went to jail. 4 of the 5 previous presidents of the Congress either went to jail or are now fugitives of justice. Central America had never seen anything like that before. The protests that led to the president stepping down spread to both El Salvador and Honduras, 2015. That was the high water mark. What we've seen since then is a determined effort by the networks. I have to be careful here because El Salvador is a little different, but certainly by the elite networks in Honduras and Guatemala to make sure what happened in 2015 never happens again. So they have taken over the Congress, they have taken over the judicial system, they've taken over the Attorney General's office. The heads of pretty much all 3 of those organizations have been sanctioned or designated by the United States as corrupt or anti-democratic actors. El Salvador is a little different. They have a president who has taken a different path. It is, I think, still largely corrupt, but I think he is moving El Salvador into a singular authoritarian state, whereas in Guatemala and Honduras, it's a little more nuanced, it's a little more diverse, but it is an authoritarian state backed by elite families and corrupt actors.
Mind if I do a follow-up question?
Yeah. I mean, we have to give others.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for having us this morning. I'm Chase Whitehouse. I'm an undergraduate in my first year of the Global Scholars Program here at SIS. And so in regards to Mexico, how does the United States best combat the increasingly violent and ideological characteristics of NTO, such as the Cartel Jalisco Nuevo Generacion, specifically that, but alongside that with President Obrador's hesitancy to accept American help on matters of national security within Mexico?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, but a very good one. So we do 2 things, right? We work directly with Mexico's federal government, and we do as much as we can with them. But we are fortunate that they are somewhat decentralized. And we have over the years been able to develop very close relationships with governors and city councils and state and local police throughout Mexico. What we have found is that whenever there is, I would say, hesitancy on the federal level to work in Mexico, there has been almost no hesitancy on the state level. They still want our training. They still want the equipment we can provide. They still want access to information that we can give them to go after networks, go after gangs, go after the violent criminals that are making their citizens suffer. So sometimes, we have to be creative. We have to be patient. And we have to find partners where we can, and that's what we do. So when we can't work with the federal, we'll try to pivot to the state. In a perfect world, we would want to work with both.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much to the both of you. I am Dina Pivich. I'm a junior at the University of Iowa, and I'm actually interning this semester in INL in the Office of Europe and Asia. So I have been exposed to a lot of the great things that INL is doing around the world. So Assistant Secretary Robinson, I was wondering, throughout your time at INL, what has been one program that maybe INL helped develop or had some sort of hand in that you're the most proud of, or maybe you feel is one of the greatest achievements of INL?
Wow, that's a great question because we do so much. I think one of the things I'm most proud of, and I was exposed to it actually for the first time when I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary in INL. We have, and this is not a secret to any of you, the Middle East is one of our toughest areas. It has been historically for a long time. We have developed a really great relationship with the Palestinian Authority and the security structures in Israel. That allows us to, even at the worst of times, maintain communication, collaboration, and cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank. And yeah, I shudder to think about all of the complexities that goes into that. But we have such great people working in INL who've been doing this for a long time. And we've built up such good credibility on both sides that it's clearly one of our hardest foreign policy challenges, but we're still able to work there. And that makes me really proud.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, current junior SIS. Can you please speak to current and emerging technologies and how those are impacting INL's mission, particularly with cryptocurrency and money laundering?
Yeah, well, so the great thing about INL is we're not experts in everything, but we have access to experts in everything. Cryptocurrencies, the whole crypto network is a challenge, not just for INL, but for law enforcement across the board, because large amounts of illicit gains, we know, are moving through all of these different technologies. But it's not just, it's not just Bitcoin, right? It is also just normal social media, Snapchat, Facebook, Venmo, Zelle, all of these criminal networks are using all of these other networks, not just to move money, but to move drugs. I was talking to a colleague in DEA the other day, and I mean, I don't know if this is anecdotal or not, but he said, if you order, if you go online and order a drug, a dietary supplement, something like that, there's a 50% chance you're going to get something laced with fentanyl. That is crazy. And that's what law enforcement in the United States and around the world is up against. And it's really, really hard. There are experts working on this kind of thing. But, if we want an internet architecture that is open and transparent, we also have to find a way, and we are working on a treaty, a UN treaty, that will find a way to make it transparent, but safeguard ordinary people. It's really hard.
Thank you.
Sure. The only other thing I would add is, in terms of technology, everybody wants drones. And INL can provide them. We provide them in Ukraine.
I've seen a lot of people are provided though, sadly.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, our last question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Stephen Burley. I'm a second-year master's student. Often in certain scenarios, when we're working with partners on issues of corruption, they'll say one thing and then do another. And many times we also rely on them for assistance in other areas or tackling other problems. How can we bring about that pressure and have those tough conversations that you alluded to without isolating them and losing support in other areas where we heavily rely on their help?
Yeah, it's really hard. And you're balancing, one issue where this is playing out in the newspapers and in the halls of Congress and all over Washington is migration. We need Mexico desperately to help us with our migration issue. We also need Mexico to do more on the fight against transnational organized crime. And it is a really tough balancing act that requires daily conversation. In fact, two people who know this far better than I do are sitting in this room. Ambassador Wayne, who was ambassador to Mexico, and his former DCM, John Feely. It's a really, really hard dance. And, I'm at a stage in my career where I can say this. When I'm testifying on the Hill and a senator or congressman asks me a question just like this, what they want to hear is, well, we're just going to be tough on them. We're going to go in and tell them what they need to do. We can't do that. If we want to maintain these relationships, if we want to have them help us when we need it, when we want to be able to call upon them to support us in the UN, then we have to, it has to be nuanced. I call it living in the gray. There are times when you can be black and white, but the vast majority of my career has been living in the gray.
Oh, that's right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Todd. Thank you, Ambassador Robinson, and especially for ending on this vitally important relationship we have with our southern neighbor, which is also deeply challenged at this moment, not only over drugs, on how to handle migration, how to handle some trade issues. That just comes with the territory. And being a diplomat means that you're often working in that gray area and trying to find solutions that brings everybody along. Sometimes you don't get there, but many times you do. So thank you very much, Ambassador Robinson, for joining us today.
Great question.
All right. Thanks to everybody for being with us.
Come over this way. They know I'm not a good one. And there's a video of you guys on the phone.
Oh, I was just there.
Yeah, I know. That's why I wanted to.
I remember who you are. You guys are. How you doing? You're doing just fine. Good to see you. How you been?
Where are we?
Still waiting.
Gonna-
Oh, you were?
Oh, yeah.
Which is a little frustrating. You're over there.
Yeah.
You asked him.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. Yeah.
I was thinking about asking him too. I had like 3 times. No, you know what I honestly did? And Piper, where is she?
I'm right here.
Piper and I both
Got your
said,
back.
this, you guys were more than you've had before. You guys were witness to something that goes on. And my sense is that it is literally lightning in a jar. And there is perhaps, I'm retired, so I can say this now. They're afraid to open. And fear what would happen. If that gets